It was an afternoon heavy with humidity in Kowloon, the kind that made the air taste like metal. Inside the narrow gym behind a set of wooden doors, a rhythmic tap-tap-tap echoed, Bruce Lee's fists colliding with the speed bag like bursts of thunder. Each strike was a punctuation mark, sharp and controlled, as if he were carving the air itself. Students stood in a semicircle, drenched in sweat, trying to follow his movements, but none could keep up. Even at rest, Bruce radiated tension, like a coiled spring that never really relaxed. His body was lean, almost fragile to the eye, but the moment he moved, it was as if the laws of motion surrendered to him. Then the door creaked open. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped in, wiping his face with a towel. His name was Ken Takahashi, an accomplished kickboxer visiting from Osaka, known for his devastating roundhouse and cocky grin. Ken had been invited by one of Bruce's students to observe the class, but from the first moment, his eyes weren't curious. They were measuring. Bruce paused mid-strike, resting his hand lightly on the bag. "Welcome," he said, his tone soft but unshakably confident. "You came to train?" Ken smirked. "To watch, maybe to learn. But I've seen your movies, Lee. You're fast, yes. But speed isn't power." The room grew still. Even the sound of the swaying bag seemed to hesitate. Bruce's lips curved, almost in amusement. "Speed isn't power?" Ken folded his arms. "No, power is weight, strength. You can move quick, but if it doesn't hurt, it's nothing." Bruce tilted his head slightly. "Then you believe speed is useless?" "Not useless," Ken said, smirking wider. "Just overrated." The students exchanged glances, sensing the tension. Bruce studied him for a moment, his calm gaze cutting deeper than any glare could. Then he gestured toward the open mat. "Then come," he said simply. "Let's test what is overrated." Ken hesitated. He hadn't expected that, but with the eyes of everyone on him, pride wouldn't let him back down. He tossed his towel aside, rolled his shoulders, and stepped onto the mat. Bruce didn't square up like a boxer or widen his stance like a karateka. He stood casually, one foot slightly forward, hands loose, breathing steady. It looked almost careless. Ken, seeing an opening, smirked again. "You sure you want to do this? I don't pull punches." Bruce's only reply was a small nod. "Neither do I." For a second, nothing happened. The air between them grew heavy. Then Ken lunged, a fast, snapping jab meant to test the distance. But before his punch even reached halfway, Bruce's hand moved. To the onlookers, it was like watching lightning strike in silence. A crack split the air, not loud, but sharp enough to echo. Ken staggered backward, clutching his chest. His eyes widened as if he'd been hit by a sledgehammer. He gasped for breath, stumbled, and dropped to one knee. It had taken less than 3 seconds. Bruce lowered his hand slowly, his breathing unchanged. He hadn't stepped back, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even broken a sweat. The student stood frozen, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Ken looked up, face flushed, eyes burning with shock. "What was that?" Bruce crouched slightly, his voice calm but precise. "That," he said, "was power." He offered a hand to help Ken up. Reluctantly, Ken took it, his pride burning hotter than the pain in his chest. "But how?" Bruce's gaze softened. "Power is not weight, it's timing, structure, connection. You can have the muscles of an ox and still be slow like mud, but when every cell of your body moves together, that is speed, and that is power." He turned back to the students, who still stood in stunned silence. "Most people separate the two," he continued, pacing slowly. "They think speed is movement and power is impact. But true power is born from unity, speed, precision, and intent working as one." Ken rubbed his chest, still feeling the phantom of that invisible punch. "What do you call that technique?" he asked. Bruce smiled faintly. "The 1-inch punch," he said. Ken frowned. "That's impossible, you barely moved." Bruce nodded. "Exactly." He walked over to a wooden board hanging on the wall. With one relaxed breath, he raised his right hand, fingers loose, thumb aligned. Then, without pulling back, he thrust forward just 1 inch, The board split cleanly in two, the sound echoing like thunder in the small gym. No wind-up, no exaggeration, just focus. Bruce turned to Ken again. When I strike, my entire being strikes with me. The punch begins long before the fist moves. Power is not what you put into the blow, it's what you remove from hesitation. Ken looked at him, still half in disbelief. You talk like a philosopher. Bruce chuckled softly. Fighting is philosophy in motion. The students began murmuring among themselves, still digesting the lesson. One of them, a young man named Peter, asked timidly, Sifu, how can we learn that? Bruce looked at him. By learning yourself, he said. Not the technique, not the form. Yourself. You must unlearn what slows you, fear, ego, tension. When the mind moves freely, the body follows. Ken, still nursing his pride, muttered, So all this time I was training wrong? Bruce shook his head. Not wrong, just incomplete. He paused. You learned to hit the body. I learned to hit the soul. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, the sound of rain began to patter against the roof. Bruce stood by the open door, looking out at the grey sky. Water, he said softly. That is what I try to be. Ken joined him at the doorway, still curious despite himself. Water? Bruce turned, his expression serene. Water is formless. It adapts. Put it in a cup, it becomes the cup. Pour it on the ground, it flows around obstacles. Strike it, and it yields. But it can also crash. That's real power. Flexibility without weakness. Strength without rigidity. Ken stared at him, silent. The arrogance in his eyes was gone. What replaced it was something else. Respect. Perhaps even humility. You know, Ken said quietly, I came here to prove you were just a movie star, but you're something else. Bruce smiled faintly. I am a student. Always. Ken nodded slowly. Maybe one day I can be one too. Bruce extended a hand once more. Then start today. And as the two men bowed to each other, the students broke into quiet applause. Not for the punch, but for what it revealed. Bruce turned back to them, his voice steady and warm. Remember, he said, the fight is never against another person. The real fight is within. The moment you conquer yourself, no one can defeat you. The rain outside turned heavier, drumming like a heartbeat against the roof. Ken gathered his things, his pride tempered by realization. Before leaving, he looked back at Bruce. You taught me more in 3 seconds than I learned in 10 years. Bruce gave a small, knowing smile. 3 seconds is all the universe needs. He turned back to the mat, resetting the bag, his body once again in perfect stillness, ready to strike, ready to learn, always becoming. And somewhere between the sound of thunder and breath, the legend of Bruce Lee grew a little larger that day. The following morning, the gym smelled of leather, liniment, and determination. The story of what had happened the day before, how Bruce Lee had dropped a professional fighter in 3 seconds, had already begun to spread. By sunrise, reporters and students from nearby dojos were showing up at the door, whispering, waiting for a glimpse of the man who had turned speed into something supernatural. Bruce arrived quietly, as he always did. No entourage, no ceremony, just a small duffel bag, a towel, and eyes that carried a kind of calm intensity few could meet for long. He bowed to his students and began his warm-up, slow, controlled, every movement an exercise in awareness. Ken Takahashi was there too, this time not as a skeptic but as a student. His pride had been bruised, but somewhere inside that humiliation was a seed, something he hadn't felt in years, hunger. Bruce noticed him and smiled faintly. You came back, he said. Ken bowed. Yesterday I came to test you. Today I came to understand you. Bruce nodded, satisfied with the honesty. Then take off your shoes, he said. We start on equal ground. The class gathered around. Bruce stood in the center of the mat and gestured toward Ken. Let's revisit what happened yesterday. Many people saw speed, some saw strength. But what I want you to see, he paused, is emptiness. Ken frowned slightly. Emptiness? Bruce paced slowly, hands behind his back. When you think of striking, your mind fills with intent. Hit hard, Hit fast, win. But the moment you fill the mind with intention, it slows. The true strike comes from stillness. No thought, no resistance. Emptiness allows clarity. He motioned to a wooden dummy in the corner and placed his palm on its arm. This, he said, is not an enemy. It is a mirror. With a smooth breath, Bruce delivered a rapid series of punches, each connecting with a sound that made the air vibrate. But his expression remained tranquil. The moment you fight your opponent, he said between strikes, you lose the real fight, because you start reacting instead of creating. Ken stepped closer, fascinated. So you're saying the best way to win is not to fight? Bruce looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly, not in challenge but in curiosity. To win is to be free. Free from anger, free from pride, free from the need to prove. He paused and turned to his class. Yesterday, Ken taught you all something important. Pride can be a teacher, if you survive it. The room chuckled softly, including Ken. Bruce continued. When he said, speed isn't power, he wasn't wrong. He was incomplete. Power without control is chaos. Speed without understanding is noise. But when the two unite in perfect timing, that's when technique disappears, and only truth remains. He clapped once, the sound sharp. Pair up, he commanded. Today we learn to feel. The students obeyed, forming pairs. Bruce walked among them like a sculptor inspecting marble, adjusting a shoulder here, correcting a wrist there. His words were quiet, but carried deep weight. Don't rush, feel the opponent's rhythm. The space between movements is where mastery hides. Ken trained opposite Bruce himself. They moved slowly at first, exchanging light taps, each step deliberate. But Bruce's rhythm began to shift, subtle, unpredictable. Ken tried to follow, but the timing felt off, as if Bruce's movements were answering questions he hadn't yet asked. Frustrated, Ken exhaled sharply. You keep changing tempo. How am I supposed to follow that? Bruce smiled. Don't follow, adapt. Ken blinked. Adapt? Bruce nodded. When water meets a rock, it doesn't resist. It flows around it, be like water. Ken took a breath and tried again, this time letting go of trying to predict. He moved instinctively, fluidly, and suddenly his palm met Bruce's arm at the perfect angle. The contact was clean, effortless. Bruce's grin widened. Good, you see? Power lives in the space you stop trying. The room seemed to exhale collectively. After class, as the students bowed and left, Ken lingered. He looked around the gym, the worn floorboards, the faded posters, the faint scent of sweat and tea, and then back at Bruce. Why do you teach? He asked quietly. Bruce raised an eyebrow. Why not? Ken shook his head. You could be making movies, living like a star, but you're here, with us. Why? Bruce looked toward the window where the sunlight cut through the blinds, stripes of gold across the floor. Because fame doesn't feed the soul, he said softly. Teaching does. When I share what I learn, I stay alive inside. When I stop, I start dying. He leaned against the wall, thoughtful. There's a moment every fighter must face, he said. When he realizes the opponent in front of him isn't another man. It's fear. Doubt. Ego. Those are the real battles. Ken nodded slowly. And if you lose that battle? Bruce smiled faintly. Then you learn. Losing is just a teacher in disguise. They stood in silence for a while, the rain outside turning into a soft drizzle. Finally, Ken broke it. You know, yesterday I thought I was strong, but when you hit me I realized I was just loud. Bruce laughed gently. Loudness is the shadow of insecurity. True power whispers. Ken took a step closer. Teach me to whisper, then. Bruce placed a hand on his shoulder. It will take time, patience, suffering. But if you are willing to fall 1,000 times, I will teach you to rise once without effort. That night, after everyone left, Bruce stayed alone in the gym. The lights were dim, the city's hum distant. He stood in front of the mirror, watching his own reflection breathe. Be water, he whispered to himself, be nothing, and become everything. He closed his eyes, extended his arm, and released another 1-inch punch, not toward a person, but into the void. The sound cracked like a gunshot. Outside, somewhere beyond the window, thunder rolled faintly across the harbor, as if the sky itself had bowed in respect. Bruce smiled quietly. Even lightning, he murmured, takes lessons from silence. Speed is not power. Power is presence, being fully alive in a single moment. Bruce Lee didn't teach people how to fight. He taught them how to exist, without resistance, without fear, without pride. When you stop trying to be strong, you become unstoppable. When you stop trying to be fast, you become timeless. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded. True strength isn't in the strike, it's in the stillness before it. Like Bruce said, be water, my friend.